Howdy folks, welcome to part 4 of my electrical age tutorial series. Today we're taking the things we learned in parts 1 through 3 and applying them to power systems. So let's get started. Now the first question you're going to ask yourself when creating a power system is, what is my load going to be like? Is it going to be a constant load with things like light bulbs that require a constant amount of power? Or is it going to be a variable load with machines and other things like macerators that require a variable amount of power? The answer to this question will determine the way you set up your power generation system. Now down here in the basement we have the most basic type of power generation system. We have a 50-volt turbine that produces a nominal 300 watts of electricity. Right now our load is a constant 240 watts, which is also nominal at 50 volts. Since our power requirements are less than our power production capabilities, we can easily meet that demand at that voltage. A problem arises when we try and run those macerators. That's going to bring our power requirements up to 640 watts, way more than that turbine can generate. This is going to result in not only a voltage drop, but a power drop as well. Now what's happening here? As you can see, that voltage is actually dropping until it reaches a certain level. If you remember, turbines produce 300 watts nominally. That's assuming it's at 50 volts. At that voltage, the power production of the turbine is exactly equal to the power consumption of the two light bulbs and the macerators upstairs. Now, the voltage you drop to depends on the difference between the amount of power you can produce versus the amount of power you consume. The greater the difference, the lower the voltage drop. Well, right now, macerating at 20 volts in the dark isn't going to be helpful or easy to see. The only solution here is to simply add more power, which we've done over here in the next basement. The second turbine brings our nominal power production up to 600 watts. Although, again, it's less than the 640 watts we need to run everything. So, again, that's going to result in a voltage drop. If you remember from tutorial 2, though, you can actually eke out a little bit more than the nominal amount of power in turbines by upgrading either the cooling or the heating side. So, adding a combustion chamber over here in this furnace, it's going to mean we're going to produce a little bit more than 600 watts. And, as we can see, we're able to meet that power requirement. This is one of the key rules in power systems, in that you're always going to have to make sure your power generation capabilities match your power requirements. If you don't, things are going to dim and not work right. This is similar to what happens when everyone in the summertime turns on their air conditioners unexpectedly. It causes blackouts, and again, things do not work right. Now, power turbines are okay for power, but really when it comes to a variable load system, you're better off using batteries. Now down here again we've got the nominal 300 watt turbine, and despite the fact he's using an active cooler and has a stone heat furnace with 2 combustion chamber upgrades, he's not going to be near enough to reach that 640 watts we require to run those macerators. So, turning them on is going to again result in a voltage drop. Here's where the batteries come in. Turning these guys on produce a boost in power, allowing us to meet that demand. If you'll note though, his power output is close to his max safe power output, and as we learned from tutorial 3, that's going to shorten his battery lifespan significantly. So, despite the fact we're technically currently meeting the power output requirements, it's good to add a second battery. That's going to distribute the load between the two and make sure they last a lot longer. Speaking of resource efficiency, turbines have a problem, in that they always use fuel even if they're not powering anything. You think this guy would shut off since he doesn't really have a place for his power to go, but actually he's running at 25%, which means he's going to use a decent amount of coal. A more efficient way to run variable load systems is reversing the role of the batteries and the turbines, and that the batteries should be your primary power source, while your turbines should be your auxiliary power source. Now with this setup, we're using the batteries as the primary power source to run these lights, and they can do so easily. As you can see here, the batteries are currently being charged, and then they discharge. They do so in a cycle, and since it's in a cycle, these turbines won't be on all the time, unlike the other rooms. This means that they won't use as much coal, and your resources are saved a bit. The one key thing you have to remember, though, is if you decide to draw a whole bunch of power out of these batteries after they've just been fully charged and your turbines have turned off. As you know, despite the fact that you can put 250 watts out safely, batteries will gladly operate above their safe limits and blow up. So if you have a really high power drain application on this type of setup, you're going to have to be sure that you won't overload your batteries before they drop to a certain voltage and your turbines kick in. Now this setup requires a decent amount of sensors and signal boxes and can get kind of complicated, so we'll cover stuff like this in a later tutorial. Now the second question you have to ask yourself when creating a power system is how far do you want that power to go? Now over here we have two towers with identical floor plans and identical wiring, except the only difference is the one on the left runs on 50 volts, while the one on the right runs on 200 volts. Each of them are keyed to turn their lights on each floor for a short amount of time, starting with the first floor and going up all the way to the 5th floor. Down here in the basement, we can monitor the power over here that's reaching each of the floors. As we can agree, the 1st floor gets more power than the 5th floor, simply due to the losses of the cable length, as we saw in tutorial 1. What's odd, though, is this terminal right here, which shows the power being generated. This also drops. If you remember, though, long cable lengths transmitting power result in a voltage drop as well. Since the lights are now at a lower voltage, as we saw in the first room, they're going to require less power. So, not only does less power get to them due to length, less power is actually produced by the turbines. Over here in the 200 volt tower, we can see that this effect is a lot less pronounced, which is in line with what we learned in tutorial 1, and that producing the same amount of power and transmitting it over a higher voltage results in less power loss, and thus less voltage loss, which would explain why our bars are a lot flatter. For a more extreme example of this, we have this tower. Now up here, we have two 200 volt turbines, which produce at least 1000 watts of power. Now this power is transformed into 4 different voltages for the 4 different cables, and taken down this pylon here, where it's then transformed back into 200 volts and fed into these 2 heat furnaces. Now this heat furnace has an element that requires 800 watts of power. This one over here has an element that requires 400 watts of power. Now each of these heat furnaces are scheduled to cycle on and off using the 50 volt cable to transmit the power, which then turns off, and the 200 volt cable transmits the power. It turns off, which goes through the 800 volt cable and the 3200 volt cable. Does this both for the 800 watt furnace and the 400 watt furnace, which can be easily seen here. The 400 watt furnace uses less power than the 800 watt furnace. It's also obvious that the voltage is going to drop for using the 50-volt cable to transmit the power, simply because there's voltage losses on the cable. So, as we can see, this voltage drop results in less power coming to the furnace, which results in the generator needing to produce less power, which results in the generator running slower. So we can see here for the 800-watt furnace using the 50-volt cable. Now the takeaway from this is that you can actually choose which way you want to transmit your power for long distances. You just have to ask yourself, do I care if all of it gets to where I want it to go? And also, how much do I want to transmit, and how much do I need at the destination? If you don't care if it gets to where it needs to go, and you don't need to transmit a bunch of power, say if you're doing a remote base where you just need a small amount of power, you can be cheap and maybe use a 50-volt cable. If you're transmitting a lot of power, or if you have a furnace, say, that needs a lot of watts, you're going to have to invest in a higher voltage cable to transmit that power more efficiently. In effect, cables have a max amount of power they can transmit over a certain length before you overload the cable with too much power transmission to make up for the losses in the cable. What type of cable you use, though, is up to you. Now, all of those methods of power generation we saw were using furnaces and turbines. There's other types of power generation, which I like to call eco-power. Now, there's two benefits to these types of power generation. The first type, obviously, is they don't require any resources like coal and stuff to create power. But the second type is that they will never blow up. Unlike a furnace or a turbine, which can overheat if you run the furnace too high, or a battery, which will explode if you draw too much power out of it at a single time, these guys will never cause your cables to explode. Unless, of course, you put too many of them on a cable and produce too much power and blow it up due to that limit. Now, the first type of this eco-power you can see is solar panels. Now, solar panels have the benefit of providing a generally constant amount of power, provided they're facing the sun. You have to be careful, though, when wiring them, as they're the only other block in this mod, besides batteries, that care which way you ground them. This red dot is going to go to the positive side, while the blue dot goes to the negative side. Similar to batteries, if you mix this up, you get an explosion. Also similar to batteries, though, you can combine them in series in order to increase voltage without using a transformer. As you can see, they only produce 14.8 volts, which means you're going to have to transform them up, or put four of them in series and have them do that for you. Another thing with the solar panels is they rotate in order to face the sun. Now, you can do this manually, but you're going to have to do that to track the sun, and it can be a pain in the butt. Or, you can add the solar tracker upgrade, which is going to automatically track it for you, as we can see here. Pretty neat to see a bank of solar panels that turn themselves in the daytime. The second type of eco-power is wind. Now, wind turbines have the benefit, unlike solar panels, of also running at nighttime. They have the drawback of needing a lot larger space requirement. As you can see here, you need 7 blocks in front, 2 blocks up, 2 blocks down, 2 blocks left, and 2 blocks right of the blades in order to get them to function. If you put a bunch of wind turbines in front of each other, or if they're simply next to trees and things, they're not going to turn and not produce power. This means that you have to be a little bit careful when planning out your wind farms. It also means you're going to have to invest in a decent amount of cables if you want to use a significant amount of wind turbines. But since they have the benefit of running day and night, it might be a better option than solar panels. The final type of green power you're going to come across is water turbines. Now, water turbines produce the least amount of power of all three eco sources, but their benefit is that they can be used anywhere where there's water. And this includes simply putting down a water source block and running the water underneath them. This makes them excellent for places underground, such as mining bases, where you really just need one light and perhaps some energy which you can put in a battery to run a macerator or a compressor. Now, all of these power generation systems, as you can see, don't really produce much power, which makes them a prime candidate for storing them in batteries. It also makes them good for variable load power systems, especially this transponder here. Now, since the transponder doesn't use any energy while idle, but uses a ton of energy when you're using it, you're going to have to use batteries. Either that or invest highly in turbines. Now, right now we can set the power sink to 2.9 kilowatts, and we need 13.8 kilojoules to go to the mining factory. Since these current-oriented batteries each provide a kilowatt of power, that's 3 kilowatts, and we're good. Also note, though, that the total energy they provide is 120 kilojoules, which in the world of batteries is extremely low. And you can even use one battery to power the transporter, although he would override its minimum 2 kilowatt power sink, so you would explode the battery. Let's take this transporter to the mining factory. Now, as you can see, he's not going to power up too quick, simply because our power sink is low. And here we are. Now, the mining factory here brings us to the third question of power systems, and that you need to ask yourself, what is your average power consumption going to be? As we saw back there with the eco power and the transponder, our average power consumption is actually going to be pretty low, and that we aren't really using any power off that circuit except when we teleport. Here, though, in the mining factory, our average power consumption is going to be high, simply because our auto miners are going to run continuously for a long amount of time. Now, each of these auto miners is fixed with a diamond drill tip, which requires 2 kilowatts of power, bringing each bank to require 6 kilowatts of power. Note, though, that auto miners use 800-volt circuits, and an 800-volt cable has a max power capacity of 5,000 watts. You would think this would overload them and cause them to explode, but electrical age has a nice quirk of allowing you to ignore power requirements if you're connecting component, such as a transformer, to component. Since we're transmitting 6 kilowatts of power through the transformer directly to the auto miner, and then directly from auto miner to auto miner, we can ignore that 5 kilowatt requirement. Note that you can't ignore the voltage requirements of cables, and attempting to do so will blow your transformer. Similarly, we have these turbines here, which are all hooked up to power the auto miner banks. Again, since the voltage comes out of the turbines at 200 volts, we can step them up through these transformers directly into the 3200 volt cable, which can handle the power flowing through it, unlike the 200 volt cable that would normally come off of these. Now, each of these turbines are using an active cooling bank, and while you can feed the power that comes out of these turbines that goes into those auto miner banks back into these cooling banks, you can run into a problem occasionally, in that if you have a load ready on a power system that's starting up, that load is going to draw the power that would normally go to the cooling banks. Now, since your power output is going to be low and your voltage is going to be low, these stone heat furnaces are going to kick on high. And since these cooling fans are running slow, your cooling power is not going to be very high, which means a lot of heat is going to build up in these turbines. If you do this for too long, the turbines will overheat before they have enough time to produce the power in order to kick all these devices on. Since your cooling fans can't keep up, you're going to explode your entire power bank. Again, this can be simply fixed by installing a switch or something that prevents devices from taking a load until the cooling fans have time to spin up. But the way I prefer to do it instead is to use a separate cooling power bank. This means that you can more accurately judge what power you're going to need and what power you can produce out of this bank without having to worry about what's going to go back into these cooling fans. It also allows you to slightly overdrive them by providing more than the 200 volts they take nominally and provide a little bit more cooling if needed. It's also a handy way to run your lighting system on a separate circuit. Now, as we can see, again with the turbines, they require a constant amount of coal when idle. Now, turning on the auto miner bank, number 1, we can see the output for each of them jumps to about 50%, which is what we'd expect, since each bank produces about 7 kilowatts, and the auto miners themselves require 6 kilowatts per bank. Similarly, if we turn on bank number 2, we can see that power jump. Note though that auto miners don't always use the same amount of power, simply because when they go and place a pipe, they don't use power for that operation. So it's going to be a little bit erratic, as shown right there. This means that your power is going to fluctuate, and your furnace levels are going to fluctuate as well. But furnaces and turbines are surprisingly good at adapting to a slightly variable load. It's just when it comes to variable loads that you have very high variability, say is what we show going from 240 watts to 600 watts, which is over 100% increase, they tend to be not efficient. Really, it just depends on how much power you expect to use. If you know you're going to use a lot of power, you really are forced to use turbines for your generation. Similarly, if you're not going to use much power, such as in a base, you might be better off using a few turbines and batteries, or you can just use an eco source and batteries. It really depends on whatever you're planning and how many materials you have. The added bonus with all these turbines is that since they can produce more power, we can kick our transponder up a notch. Now we can sink 13.5 kilowatts, meaning we'll transport a lot faster. Now the max level of this is 20 kilowatts, and that's an unwieldy amount of turbines. Well, that's about it for power systems. Next time we'll get into a little bit more on how to regulate those. As we saw with the battery-powered ones, it can be kind of complicated. But for now, you should have enough to generate something to light up your base. This has been Ben Plotz, signing off.